Good morning. In this unit, we're going to be talking about language use, and there are a few specific points that we're going to be covering. So, firstly, we'll be talking about how to summarize and paraphrase a text, how to make an inference, and what that is, and we're going to be discussing both connotation and denotation, and the grammatical point of view. So there are a few terms that you'll need to know after covering this chapter, so make sure that you are comfortable with these terms and can easily define them and use them. Firstly, we'll be talking about summarizing. Summarizing means to give an overview of sort of an essay or a longer piece of text. You're going to be rewriting that or retelling that in your own words. So the steps to doing that involve reading the information carefully and highlighting the most important points. What do you think the author is trying to get across to the audience? Then create an outline and tell each one of those points in your own words. What I recommend that students do when I'm working with them in the Writing Center and they're trying to summarize is I ask them to read a paragraph or two at a time and then turn the original paper over so that they can't see it, and then write about that paragraph on their own paper. And that kind of helps to avoid unintentional plagiarism. Make sure that you're keeping the ideas in the same order when you summarize, and always cite the original author. Remember that these are not your ideas, so you can use author attribution throughout your summary by saying things like, the author says, according to the author, in the article, so on and so forth. Paraphrasing is a little bit different than summarizing. Summarizing is what you do with a longer essay, but paraphrasing has to do with like individual ideas. So what you're doing is you're taking the ideas from the original essay and you are paraphrasing each one of them. And a paraphrase may not necessarily be any briefer than the original, whereas a summary always sort of shrinks the idea down into its most concise format. Paraphrasing may sometimes be as long or longer than the original. It just depends on what it takes for you to restate the idea in a way that makes sense to you. You want to keep quotes to a minimum when you're paraphrasing. Maintain your own voice. Don't just copy the original author's words and then change a couple of the terms or phrases or move things around. You want to make sure that you are really writing the material in your own words, in your own voice. This is typically the most common way that we expect you to incorporate source material in your writing. So as you're working through your course content and working on your papers, you'll be doing a lot of paraphrasing. So make sure that you understand this element and ask questions if you need more help with this. One of the other things that you'll be doing a lot is making inferences. An inference is essentially a guess that you're making that is based on the clues and the evidence that you find in the text, as well as your own prior knowledge, based on your experiences just kind of in life. And it helps you to draw conclusions. Not everything that an author wants you to know is explicitly stated in the text in a way that you can point to it with your finger. Sometimes you have to make guesses. Sometimes you have to make inferences. And this is a skill that we all possess. We do this a lot every day. When we meet someone new, we typically make some inferences about them. Or if we walk into the room and someone in our family is, very angry and upset and their arms are crossed and they have an upset look on their face, you can make an inference, right, about how they might be feeling based on those cues, those clues or evidence, for example. So we are used to making inferences, and in critical thinking, what we want you to do is just really think intentionally about that process. For example, what conclusions can you make about this man in this picture? And once you've made those conclusions, I want you to really think and identify the clues that you're using or the prior knowledge that you are taking into account when you make those conclusions. You might be looking at the tattoos, you might be looking at the man's shirt. He's got keys in his hand, which I think you can't see because of my video, but those all might lead you to the conclusion that this man is a trucker or a biker. You might not trust him. You might think that he looks a little bit worrisome, or I have had some crazy answers to this question over the years. But you're using the clues that you have at hand and your own prior knowledge about the world in order to make an inference. But now I'm going to ask you, what conclusions can you make about this gentleman? So again, think about how the clues have changed and how you are using your prior knowledge to interpret those clues, and how that can change the conclusions that you've made. Now, which set of conclusions is accurate? That's hard to tell, because sometimes inferences are not always objective. But your job as a critical thinker is to use the clues and your own knowledge as best as you can, and to make really good inferences that don't rely on prejudice or stereotypes. You have to really question the inferences that you make. So that's an important thing to consider when you are making inferences as a critical thinker. I'm going to move my screen back. And then we're going to move on to talk a little bit about author's tone. Tone helps you to understand the author's position on a particular topic. Where do they stand? How do they feel? What did they think about this? It can help you determine their purpose for writing and the main idea of the overall writing. You would want to consider who they're writing for when you're trying to determine tone. Think about the source. Is this in a medical journal, or is this in an entertainment magazine? Their tone is going to be different. Their audience will be different depending on the source. It can help you to identify purpose, or identifying the purpose can sometimes help you identify the tone. Those two things work in conjunction. For example, if it were in a medical journal, the tone would probably be educational or informational. Whereas if it were in an entertainment journal, the tone might be sarcastic or humorous. In order to really determine tone, kind of the bottom line is to examine the individual words that the author is using. What words are designed to make the author, or to make the audience feel a particular way? And that's where we begin to talk about both connotation and denotation. So I don't have a separate slide about denotation, but just know that denotation is sort of the default. It's the dictionary definition of a word. What would you find if you looked up happy in the dictionary, right? It's going to tell you what that means. Connotation, however, is not usually in the dictionary. Connotation is the way a word makes you feel, right? It can be individual or societal, right? So maybe, I particularly feel positive about dogs. So when I read something about dogs, it has a positive connotation for me. But you might have a negative experience with dogs. So when you read something about dogs, that could have a negative connotation for you. Whereas the denotation of the word dog is in the dictionary. It just tells you exactly what the word means. So connotation and denotation are different, and they can be different depending on how the audience interprets those words. But often connotation is societal. If we say something is, exciting, that's typically positive. Whereas if we say something is shocking, that's typically pretty negative. Even though exciting and shocking kind of denotatively mean similar things, they have very different feelings. So writers deliberately choose the words that they use in order to manipulate their audience, to make them feel a certain way. So being able to identify heavily connotated words will help you to determine what the author's tone is, what their main idea is, and what their purpose is. Are they trying to convince you to feel a certain way? So here are some examples of words that have positive and negative connotations societally. And of course, some of us may have more positive or more negative personal connotations, but these are ones that are sort of generally accepted. And for example, if you look at the difference between chatty and loud, if you were trying to maybe spare someone's feelings, you would say that they were being chatty. But if you were annoyed at their behavior, you might tell your friend that they were being very loud. So we can see that sometimes, even though words share a similar denotation, they have very different feelings associated with them. And this can help you determine how the author feels about a subject, whether they choose to talk about surprise or whether they choose to talk about shock. That can help you to understand their position. So there's a passage here. Oh, I can't move my, okay. That seems to work better. I apologize. So there are two passages here, and essentially what I'd like to ask you to do is to just go ahead and pause the video, read both of the passages, and then ask yourself, which one do you think is more positive, and what connotative words in those passages help you determine whether the author feels positively or negatively about Mary Stuart. If you've already done that and you've paused it and you've been able to pick out some of the connotative words, we're going to move on to the next one, which is a quick exercise, just asking you to read this one excerpt. And then the question here is really, do you think that the author approves or disapproves of the situation? And what connotative word is a clue? There's one word here that really tells you how the author feels about the situation. Then how could you change that one word in order to make it neutral or positive? So the word, if you've already read it and you're thinking about it, is crawling. If you think about what we, how we define crawling, it's kind of a neutral word, but connotatively, when you think of the word crawling, the nation's capital is crawling with lawyers, it feels pretty negative. It feels kind of like bugs or insects or something, right? So it's a very negative connotation. And you could change that word to say that the nation's capital is full of lawyers, or is flourishing with lawyers and lobbyists, or some variation thereof. All right, finally, point of view. I have a few minutes left. Grammatical point of view refers to the perspective from which the author is writing. So in the last unit, we talked about point of view in terms of the author's position. Do they agree or disagree with the topic that they're writing about? But in this case, point of view is grammatical point of view. And what we're talking about is the pronouns that are used in the writing. So this is, the options here are first, second, and third person point of view, and each one is a little bit different. First person point of view is talking from the writer's perspective. I did something. This is my something, my opinion. We agreed. Okay, so there are a couple of examples here. Essentially, what you need to know is that this is a very personal, informal tone. It might be appropriate for a personal essay or a reflection, but it would not be appropriate for an academic paper. In the second person point of view, typically we're directing our thoughts or our ideas to the audience directly. We're saying you or your. It's never acceptable in academic writing. I'm going to ask you to avoid that entirely. Here are a couple of examples of the same sentence from the last slide, only written in second person point of view. Instead of, I think laser eye surgery is effective, we're saying you should consider it. And then finally, third person point of view. This is the most common objective form that we're going to ask you to use for academic writing. This focuses on events, issues, or people that are outside of the writer and the reader. So we are a lot more separated from the action with third person point of view. It is the primary tone that's used for professional writing, and it uses pronouns like he, she, they, his, hers, theirs, it, and its. Also one. As in this last example, to overcome any of life's challenges, one must first admit that they exist. So you can see that changing the pronoun use changes the focus of the sentence. And what we're going to ask you to do in 101 and 102, and pretty much any of your writing courses and at any point in your life, we're going to ask you to avoid second person point of view entirely. Only use first person point of view in very specific situations where you've been asked to provide your own opinion or your own reflection or response. And mainly try to stay in third person point of view. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Unit 2 language use presentation. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me and I'll do what I can to help answer them.